Здравствуйте! Я рада приветствовать гостей Иннопрома. Я – воплощенная технология, символ научного интереса человека к будущему. Материализуюсь там, где развитие технологий служит повышению качества жизни. Поэтому я здесь, в Екатеринбурге, на Иннопроме. Мир изменяется. Новые технологии трансформируют сознание низших людей, их убеждения и ценности. Избежать изменений невозможно, но нужно постараться сделать их изменениями к лучшему. Изучая будущее, человечество может лучше подготовиться к нему, принимать правильные решения и осознавая их последствия. Человеческая мысль издревле рождает технологию, стремящуюся сделать условия существования общества максимально комфортными. С течением тысячелетий мы прошли путь от палки к опалке и колеса к использованию робототехники и биотехнологиям. И скорость создания ультра-новых технологий в 21 веке достигла максимального значения. А это значит, что в недалеком будущем нас ждут еще более радикальные перемены. И наша цель – их спрогнозировать и направить в позитивное русло. Так давайте вместе и прямо сейчас начнем планировать и строить будущее. Ответственность за будущее лежит на нас. Это наш выбор.
Ну что ж, спасибо виртуальному персонажу Кате. Возвращаемся в офлайн и о будущем выступления всех сегодняшних участников. Пожалуйста, приготовьте наушники для перевода, поскольку не боясь нового юридического статуса иностранных агентов, всех докладчиков здесь пригласили из-за рубежа. Итак, первый Гай Кавасаки, человек, которого называют евангелистом высоких технологий. Вчера отец маркетинговой стратегии компании Apple, сегодня вечером предприниматель, основатель компании Garage Technology, помогающий молодым IT-стартаперам начать свой собственный бизнес. Вот так, от Apple до гаража. Гай Кавасаки, прошу вас.
Good morning. My name is Guy Kawasaki, and I'm here from Silicon Valley in California. And my task today is to teach you. Should I stay away from that? My task today is to teach you about innovation, the lessons that I specifically learned from Steve Jobs. I worked in the Macintosh division for Steve Jobs. I actually worked for Steve Jobs twice. I worked in the Macintosh division from 1983 to 1987. I was Apple's software evangelist, so my job was to convince people to write Macintosh software. I left, the Macintosh division was probably the largest collection of egomaniacs in the history of America. That record was recently broken by Facebook, but I believe that the Macintosh division held that record for about 25 years. Because we worked for Steve, we had very special rules, unlike any other part of Apple. We had a very interesting travel policy, which was that any Macintosh division employee could fly first class for any flight that was over 2 hours. And my interpretation of the rule was that the 2 hours begins at the moment you leave your apartment. So I flew first class everywhere for years. Back then the company had the Apple II division and the Macintosh division. The Apple II division was shipping thousands of Apple IIs, essentially paying for Apple. And the Macintosh division was still trying to finish Macintosh. So I worked for Steve. It was arguably the most interesting experience of my life. And as you all know, Steve recently passed away. And so this speech is dedicated to him and the art of innovation that I learned from him working in the Macintosh division. I will say that I think that Steve was one of the greatest visionaries in the history of business. We have another great visionary with us today, Ray Kurzweil. And Steve was just a great person to work for. He taught me so much about innovation. So I'm going to distill what I learned from Steve into the lessons that I believe I can pass on to you as entrepreneurs and as innovators so that you can change the world and make the world a better place. The first thing that I learned from Steve is that quite often people who are experts, who claim to be experts, particularly famous people who are journalists and reporters, they are not visionaries. Experts can tell you what's wrong with what a visionary does, but cannot, on the other hand, invent the future like a visionary. And time again in Apple's history, the experts said that Apple would fail. That Apple would fail with the Macintosh, that Apple would fail with the iPod, iPad, iPhone. Many times Apple told us, or visionaries were completely contrary to what experts will say. I bet that Ray would share the same opinion. That experts are very good at criticizing, but not creating. For example, I want to show you what some experts said that was proven wrong. The first example, the chairman of IBM, Thomas Watson, in 1943, said that I think there is a world for 5 computers. The chairman of IBM thought there was a world market for 5 computers. I have 5 Macintoshes in my house. I have all the computers he anticipated in the world in my house today. Second example, this is a Western Union internal memo. This telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. So in 1876, Western Union said that telephones were of no value to Western Union. Western Union today should be PayPal, but it's very difficult to go from telegraph to internet if you skip telephone in the middle. Third example, there is no reason why anyone would want a computer in their home. Ken Olsen, founder of DEC, said this in 1977. Ken Olsen said that there was no reason for a personal computer. No one would want a personal computer in their home.
Что очень правильно, что сессия началась вот именно с такой культовой фигуры, потому что, наверное, Стив Джобс лучший пример того, что человеческий гений живет в той среде, которая востребована современностью. И его жизнь, и его труды, его достижения – это лучший ответ, очевидно, на обычные сегодняшние вопросы. Но вот где великие писатели, которые меняют мир, или где великие политики, которые меняют мир, почему больше не рождаются Толстых, не рождается Ганди, но рождается Стив Джобс. Временем востребован такой тип человеческого гения. Господин Кавасаки, скажите, что было самым дорогим и самым дешевым из идей, которые вы претворяли в жизнь?
Well, by far, the idea that was the most impactful for me was working on Macintosh, because Macintosh was one of the curves in personal computing. And we went from Apple I to Apple II to MS-DOS to Macintosh. So to be part of that revolution was a very exciting thing. So that was the most impactful decision I made. And I always Steve is that you should always be thinking different, that you don't necessarily simply go along with the crowd. And Apple has achieved such a degree of success that today, at this point, ironically, thinking different means considering something not from Apple. And I happen to think that Android is a better operating system for a phone. So I am thinking different, as Steve Jobs taught me to do.
Замечательное выступление, и продолжаем программу. Спасибо. Мы даже идем немножко с опережением графика, и если устроители подскажут, то, возможно, потом еще и вопросы из зала. Наш следующий эксперт, Рэй Кунцвейн, сам выдающийся изобретатель нашего времени, создатель первого читающего устройства для слепых, первого музыкального синтезатора, способного воспроизводить звуки рояля и других инструментов, автор мировых бестселлеров, футурологических прогнозов, обладатель национальной медали технологий США и 19 докторских степеней. Рэй Кунцвейн, пожалуйста.
Great to be with you. Let's see, are you on here? Can you hear me? Is that good? Yeah? It's my second trip to Russia. I was in Moscow 5 months ago, and I sense a optimism about the future, confidence. And I will say that optimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy, so that's a very good harbinger of the future. I think Russia is very well positioned to create the future and be a leader, because the future is not going to be based so much on natural resources, but on things like intellect, ideas, inventions, technology, science, and mathematics, all of which are areas that Russia has been very strong. I started being interested in computers around 1960, over 50 years ago, and all the mathematicians that I read were Russian. One in particular, Markov, which is a 19th century. And increasingly, more and more things are going to be dominated by information technology. So this is what I was going to cover. Any questions on any of this? Okay, I'll go through it a little more slowly. So this is the graph I had in 1981. Although this goes through 2009, so I had it only up to 1980 at that time. And this is the amount of computation you can get, calculations per second per constant dollar, since the 1890 census. And the progress is kind of hidden by this graph because it's a logarithmic graph. Every level on this is 100,000 times greater than the level below it. So that little modest curve represents trillions-fold increase since the 1890 census. It's actually several billion times just since I was a student. I mean, look at this computer here, and this is an Android phone. This is 100,000 times smaller than the computer I used when I was a student in the late 60s at MIT. It's several million times less expensive, It is several thousand times more powerful. That's a several billion-fold increase in price performance just since I was a student. And we'll do that again in the next 25 years. This will again be billions of times more powerful per constant ruble or constant dollar. It will be 100,000 times smaller in size. Again, gives you some idea of what will be feasible. And this has gone through many different paradigms. It's not just Moore's Law. We were shrinking vacuum tubes in the 1950s. CBS, the American network, predicted the election of Eisenhower in 1952, the first time the American networks did that with a vacuum tube-based computer. Finally, they were shrinking the vacuum tubes. They got to a point where they couldn't do that anymore and keep the vacuum. And that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. It just went to another paradigm. Guy Kawasaki showed you this curve, one curve leading to another. Each of these are different S-curves, different approaches, techniques that take you to a higher level. And I want to say one thing about exponential growth, is that it's not intuitive. We have intuitive predictors about what the future will be like, and they're linear, not exponential. When we walked through the fields 1,000 years ago, we looked up ahead and said, okay, there's an animal walking this way, I'm walking this way, we're going to cross paths in about 20 seconds, I better go a different way. That was good for survival. We were making predictions about the future, and we used those predictions to help our own safety. That's in fact why we have a brain, to make predictions about the future. But these predictions about the future are linear. We assume that animal is going to keep going at the same speed. That's a pretty good assumption. With these information technologies, they don't progress that way. They progress exponentially. They double every period of time. And we say, well, does that make that big a difference? If I take 30 steps linearly, that's our intuition about what we think will happen in the future. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I get to 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, doubling every time, 2, 4, 8, 16, that reflects the reality of computers or communication technologies or any information technology. I get to 1 billion at step 30. It makes a very profound difference. Time magazine had a cover story on my idea of this, what I call law of accelerating returns. And in fact, when I was here in Moscow last time, we had a conference which was titled 2045, which was based on this article. And they wanted to print that same curve, but they said, we just covered this particular computer in our magazine a few weeks ago. We want you to include this on the graph. I said, okay, and it's right, it's the last black point there. It's right on the curve. And this is a curve that I set 30 years ago. So it has been very predictive. So here's a different technology. This is communication technologies. This is called Cooper's Law after Martin Cooper. Martin Cooper invented something you may be familiar with, which you've heard reference to this morning. It's the mobile phone. And when he first invented it, a mobile phone was in fact very expensive. You had to be rich to have one. Today there are actually 6 billion of them in the world. A kid in Africa with a smartphone has access to more information and knowledge with a few keystrokes walking around than the President of the United States or Russia did 15 years ago. It's a very powerful, I think, democratizing technology. But that curve on the right is a logarithmic curve. Every level on that is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. And that's the number of bits we're sending wirelessly in the world. So a century ago, that was Morse code over AM radio. Today, it's 4G networks. But again, look at how smooth and predictable a trajectory that is. It's really quite remarkable. Genetic technologies, DNA sequencing cost, the first genome cost $1 billion. We're now down to about $10,000. $1,000 genome is within reach. The amount of genetic data we're sequencing has doubled every year. The Genome project was controversial when it was first introduced, and halfway through the project, it was a 15-year project announced in 1990. So around 1998, critics said, I told you this isn't going to work. I mean, here you are halfway through the project and you've only finished 1% of the project. So 7 or 8 years, 1% is going to take over 700 years, like we said. My reaction is, no, we're almost done.